Hello, Horror Stories. My name is Hernan. I am a truck driver, and I have been one all my life. I carry goods from one place to another on many highways in the northern United States. I have always liked driving, especially at night, when the tranquility and landscapes combine in a way that I enjoy. But something happened to me that changed my life, a paranormal event, that since that night I know that I am not the same. I was on Route 90, everything normal as always. It was after 11 at night when I received a call from my wife. Her voice sounded strange, as if she were very far away. The only thing I could understand was that he was telling me to come home. I didn't understand what was happening, but I was even more scared when the call was disconnected. I called her again and again, but she didn't answer. I was instantly worried, and without hesitation I turned around and headed down the route back home. My head was spinning, thinking about what could be happening. I was on the phone the whole way. But he didn't call me again. I didn't know if I had no signal, or if something was really wrong. She never called me if it wasn't urgent, knowing that I'm on the road at that time of night. With each kilometer I advanced, my worry grew, until I finally arrived home after a few hours that seemed eternal. When I parked in front of the house, I noticed something was wrong. The front door was ajar and all the lights were off. I ran inside and found the inside of the house in chaos, with furniture thrown everywhere. In that moment, I felt a terror that I had never experienced. I desperately screamed my wife's name, going through each room with my heart beating a mile an hour. Elizabeth did not respond. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of my footsteps on the objects scattered on the floor. I climbed the stairs two at a time until I reached our room. At that moment, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. Upon answering, a police officer identified himself and informed me that Elizabeth had been in an accident on the highway earlier that afternoon and had died instantly. A car on the opposite side had passed the red light at full speed, losing control and crashing head-on into hers. At that moment, my life stopped. I felt like my body was collapsing. But it couldn't be. That was impossible. She had called me a few hours ago after the supposed accident. I checked the call history, and sure enough, there it was. Elizabeth's call at 11 o'clock at night. It couldn't be a mistake. I told the policeman that he must be wrong, that they were confused, but he insisted that I show up first thing the next day to identify the body, and that he was very sorry for my loss. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed awake looking for any sign of her in every corner of the house. It was the most terrifying and painful thing I had ever experienced. I checked the call history again and again, hoping to find some explanation. In my desperation, I even tried calling her again, hoping that somehow she would answer and tell me that it was all a misunderstanding. But of course the call didn't connect. The next morning I went to identify her, and yes, it was her. Elizabeth had died in that accident. I no longer had any doubts. The return home was a blur. I barely remember the trip. I felt a tightness in my chest, and it seemed like time had stopped. Upon entering the house, everything was confusing. There was an inexplicable emptiness. Days passed, and I began to feel something strange. At night, I heard whispers and footsteps, as if someone was walking and suddenly stopped. Objects appeared in unexpected places and then disappeared. The television was turned on at full volume in the middle of the night. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was post-traumatic stress or the grief I was going through, but the restlessness was constant. I felt a paranoia that didn't leave me alone. I had the feeling that something else lived in the house. One night, while I was trying to sleep, the phone downstairs rang. I ran down, but I didn't arrive to answer. As I turned to lie down on the bed, it rang again. When I picked up, I couldn't hear anything on the other end of the line, only an eerie breathing whispering my name. It sounded like Elizabeth's voice. I felt panic. I was sure my mind was torturing me again, or it was some practical joke. I hung up immediately and disconnected the phone. I couldn't take it anymore. The next day I was going to work, so I took a pill to ensure I could sleep uninterrupted and went to bed. I went off the road in the afternoon. I had a long drive of about 12 hours to my destination, so I knew I would have to park the truck for a few hours at night to rest. After 2 in the morning, I parked next to a gas station, turned off the lights, and went to sleep in my cabin. Just a few minutes after closing my eyes, I heard my wife's voice whispering my name in my ear. At that moment, I jumped out of bed and quickly got out of the truck. Of course, when I opened my eyes, there was no one there. What he had heard was real. He wasn't even asleep to have dreamed it. Not know what to do. I got out of the truck and walked around aimlessly until I finally sat down on the sidewalk and started crying uncontrollably. My mind was spinning, unable to understand why I was experiencing something so chilling without finding answers. Suddenly, a colleague from another truck that was parked a few meters from mine approached. He asked me if I needed help or if I was okay. I answered yes. How could I explain to a stranger everything that was happening to me? I told him I had just had a bad day and that everything would be all right. He asked me if I was waiting for someone, and I explained no, I was working. I told him I had parked there to rest a little before delivering the goods in the morning. He frowned at me and asked, "So who was the woman who got out of her truck a few minutes ago?" I looked at him in shock. "What woman?" I responded with some exaltation. He explained to me that he had seen an older, somewhat disheveled-looking woman get out of my truck. What seemed even more strange to him was that he saw her walking towards the mountain, assuming she was going to the bathroom, but she had not yet returned. I looked at him in disbelief, trying to process what he had just told me. For a woman to get out of my truck and walk into the bush without me realizing it was completely disconcerting. I didn't know what to think or what to do at that moment. I looked towards the bush, trying to see if I could make out any figures in the darkness, but there was nothing but shadows and silence. That's when I knew I needed help. A few days later, I visited a psychic who had been recommended to me, although I was always skeptical of these types of experiences. However, what I was experiencing was so real that I couldn't ignore it. As I sat across from her, the atmosphere became thick. The light of the candle began to flicker, and I felt a cold sweat all over my body like never before. The psychic took my hands and, after a long silence, looked me straight in the eyes, and without me having mentioned anything of what had happened previously, she said to me, "Son, the whispers that seem to be from your wife are not from her. One evil, angry entity has taken over your soul, making you believe it is Elizabeth. Before he died, he was the victim of a very powerful job that you must confront immediately, or it will haunt you for the rest of your life. The road accident that ended his life was caused by this malevolent presence, manipulated by dark entities." She told me that the first call I received that day was probably no longer from her asking for help, and that all the chaos I found when I returned home was a product of the anger of this presence. He also warned me that I had an energy attached to me, possibly so powerful that this demonic entity would chase anything that crossed its path. He told me that he clearly saw in his mind the woman who had carried out this evil deed. It turned out to be someone in my wife's work environment, a colleague who had caused all this, perhaps out of envy or greed. That his presence was very dark and that his soul was possessed. He blessed me with holy water, gave me certain instructions, and advised me to visit a specialized priest. Then I left. I had a hard time believing all this. My wife was a very good person. I couldn't imagine anyone doing such a job for her and wishing her harm. There was no reason to do it, much less to take his life. It was unthinkable that a co-worker would cause all this. I followed the woman's instructions and finally called a priest to bless the house and me. It was a very traumatic moment. I felt the presence of dark souls, and everything became chaos. The objects began to move violently from one side to the other, while I was decomposed and heard the priest shouting louder and louder and throwing holy water throughout the house. The whispers intensified incessantly, until suddenly everything stopped as if someone had turned off a switch. Calm returned, the thick atmosphere disappeared, and I regained my composure. The priest had to sit for a moment, and finally, after more than 2 hours of trying and fighting against those evil presences, he told me, "Son, that dark force that lived there is gone. Now you can be calm and live in peace." Despite being freed, to this day I am still traumatized and praying for my wife every night. Be careful, because evil stalks us without us knowing it. If you have enjoyed this story, we invite you to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any others. Until next time.